Good evening. I hope you're all doing well. Today we are learning Maseches Zevachim Daf Nun, um, and we're starting toward the bottom of Mem Tes Amud Beis in the parentheses. You'll see there it says Hekesh Ugzera Shava Kal Vachomer, and there's a missing phrase there of Ubinyan Av. Now these are four classical types of limudim of how we get from pasuk to psak, how we get from what the Torah says to a drasha. Let's just review the four of them. A hekesh, again, 15 lines from the bottom of Mem Tes Amud Beis. A hekesh is where ideas are similar and they are therefore expanded one to the other. A gzera shava is where you have the same word in multiple psukim, let's say tesvav, tesvav, and we bring over ideas from one sugya to the other. The next is kal v'chomer. If this is true in scenario X, then this is for sure true in scenario Y. And the last is a binyanav, where an idea is taught one time and we use that to just proliferate and push out. It applies in all other scenarios that are similar. Four different types of limudim. And here is the question of the day. And this is a blot plus of Gemara. It's more than we're going to learn today. We're going to learn one blot, but it actually goes beyond what we're going to learn today. Let's look at all four of them. If I start with a hekesh, can I then extend from the hekesh to another hekesh? That's question one. If I start with a hekesh, can I extend from there to a gzera shava? If I start with a hekesh, can then I then go to a kal v'chomer? If I start with a hekesh, can I build off of that for a binyanav? So we're going to take these four methods of learning and cross-reference them with each other. So we should end up with a box of 16 psukim. Okay, some of them are tekus, they're the easy ones. The other ones are not so easy. And this morning I was at work. I got a text message from Ruvain Handler, 16 boxes. He sent me this gorgeous little chart. It was very well done. So that's what we're going to. What was I doing? I didn't say I built the box. I said he sent me the box. I know who's in the room, Stan. You don't think I know you're sitting back there sipping your sugarless drink. I got you. Cheers. Yeah, I have enough sugar in mine for the two of us. So let's get started with our big matrix that we're going to work on here. Davar, the beginning part is easy. Davar halamed behekish, ein chozer malamed behekish. Question number one asked and answered. If you have a hekish, you're not allowed to use hekish number one to extend to hekish number two. Says the Gemara, I midirava, I midiravina. If you look back over the last blot, there's multiple authors of this psak. You cannot learn from one hekish to another. Davar halamed behekish. What about mahu sheyalamed bigzera shava? If I started with a hekesh, can I then extend a limud from that hekesh to a gzera shava? Tashma, last of the short lines. Reb Nasan ben Avtul Nis Omer, minayin lepricha bebegadim. When we're dealing with saras, if it spreads across an entire beget, the whole beget is covered in saras, shehi tahora. How do we know? Ne'emar karachas v'gabachas bebegadim. V'ne'emar karachas v'gabachas ba'adam. Malahalan parach b'kulo tahor. Just like by a person, if a person's whole body was covered in saras, he'd be tahor. That's not normal. That's not the Torah's version of saras. Avkan parach b'kulo tahor. The same thing would be true. Now, this is a gzera shava, right? But how do we know that an adam? We said it as if it was pasha, but says the Gemara v'hasam, the adam himself minala. Where did we learn that the Adam, that if he was parach bekulo, that he'd be tahor? So says the Gemara, that was from a hekesh. Dichsiv, me rosho ve'ad raglav, the iskash rosho the regel. Malahalan kulo hafach lavan parach bekulo tar, avkan kulo hafach lavan parach bekulo tar. What do we see from here? That the bedrock of this started with an Adam, and by him we said we learned behekesh that if he's parach bekulo, he's going to be tahor. From there, we then made a gzera shava. So what do we see? What was our question? Our question was, are you allowed to have a hekesh and then extend to a gzera shava? Seems like you are. Seems like you are, because that's how we learned that when it comes to begadim, that if you're parach bakula, that we know you're tar, but that was based on the starting point was a hekesh overlaid with a gzera shava. That was exactly our question. Box number 2 in our matrix. Says the Gemara, hold on 1 second. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, I agree with you that outside of the world of Kachim, 100% correct, you can extend from one box to the other, from Hekesh to Gzeru Shavra, from Kal V'chomer to Binyav, no problem. Chutz minat Kachim. But when it comes to Kachim, we have a different rule. She'ein dan and lamed milamed. That's not true when it comes to the world of kachim. So if you're trying to bring me a raya, don't bring me a raya from outside of kachim. You're trying to bring me from tzaras. Good. I'm asking. I agree with you because it's not kachim. But in the world of kachim, we have different set of rules. The im kain, if what you're saying is true, says the Gemara, says Rav Yochanan, then if, in other words, let me say this out. If we have a hekesh upon which you're allowed to build a gzeira shava, so then im kain lo yomar tzfona be'asham. Then I wouldn't have needed the word tzfona when it comes to the korban asham, which we've spoken about extensively, because v'teisi b'gzeira shava the kadshe mechatas. I could have learned it in a gzeira shava, but we didn't. Why didn't we? Because we weren't allowed to, says Rav Yochanan. Because perhaps when you start with a hekesh, you're not then allowed to add a layer of a gzeira shava. Lav lememra, doesn't it teach us by virtue of the fact that it didn't say this gzeira shava from kadshe kachim to teach us that we don't need tzvona by asham? Lav lememra, the davar halamed behekesh ein chozer melamed b'gzeira shava. Sounds like Rav Yochanan is a beautiful argument. Sounds like you're not allowed to do this. You're right. It's by tzaras, no problem, because it's not kachim. But in kachim, we're not allowed to do this. Says the Gemara. Well, wait 1 second. The Dilma, perhaps, says the Gemara, that really says the Gemara, V'dilma mishum de'ika lemifrach. Maybe the reason over there why we didn't do a gzeira shava was because malachata sheken mechaperes al chai bekrisus. Maybe you couldn't have compared to the world of asham because achatas can be mechaper and chai bekrisus. Says the Gemara, kodesh kodashim yiserek sibi. That's not true. When it comes to the gzeira shava that we could have and should have learned, there we have extra words. Kodesh kodashim are yisere. They're extra words. What's going on over here in the Rishonim, they explain, is that this gzeira shava is what we refer to as a gzeira shava mufna, where the words that we're using for the gzeira shava are perfectly available, unencumbered. When you have a gzeira shava mufna, there are no arguments to the gzeira shava. We don't undercut because of one svara to one side or one svara to the other. So in this case, we fully could have learned the gzeira shava to tzfona, but we didn't. Therefore, Rav Yochanan is right. That when it comes to non-kachim matters, then he agrees. But when it comes to kachim, it's not true. Because had it been true, we would have seen it by the asham, that by asham the Torah wouldn't have said tzfona, but it did. Why? Because it must be the davar halamed behekesh eino chozer umelamed l'gzeira shava. That was box number 2. We're on the very bottom line of Mem Testament base. Here we go with box number 3. Davar halamed mihekesh. What about chozer umelamed bekal v'chomer? We've spoken about hekesh to hekesh. We've spoken about hekesh to gzeira shava. What about a hekesh to a kal v'chomer? So says the Gemara, what do we do there? No problem. Midatana debei Rabbi Shmuel. And because the Gemara thinks that we just don't forget things, that it just leaves it as that like we're supposed to know what it's talking about. That's very adorable, but I didn't know what we were talking about. So Rashi here tells us what's going on. We learned about this 9 blot ago, which in this Masech is a long time ago. And this was talking about a kal v'chomer that followed a hekesh in regards to I wrote it on the side here, the Par Kohen Gadol and the Seirei Avodah Zarah and the Seirei Yom Kippurim. We're not going to go back into this, but our third box is that, yes, that if you have a hekesh and you want to build on the hekesh with a kal v'chomer, mutter. Where's the precedence from? From Rabbi Shmuel. And now, that fourth box, says the Gemara, is davar halamed behekesh mahu she'alamed bebinyanav. What would be the din? Asks the Gemara, if I start with a hekesh, and from the hekesh, I want to build a binyanav. I want to build a general principle to spread widely across the realms of Torah. Top of Nun Amud Aleph, the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yirmiyah. Rav Yirmiyah says, it can't be that it's okay. It can't be that off of a hekesh you're allowed to do a binyanav. Because lo lichtov tzvona ba'asham v'teisi mi binyanav mechatas. Because maybe I could have built a binyanav from the world of chatas. That just like chatas is in the north, all korbanos are in the north. Or all korbanos that are chatas oriented are in the north. But we didn't say that. So it says the Gemara, I should have been able to. Lamai hilchas kasve. Why then did we write tzfona? Why didn't we learn it from a binyanav? Lav lameimra. It must be to teach us that the davar halamid behekesh ein chozer melamid bebinyanav. So again, we're not done yet, but this would have been the answer to our fourth box We did hekesh to hekesh, which we said is not allowed. We did hekesh to gzeira shava, which Rabbi Yochanan shut down. We did hekesh to kal v'chomer, which Tana the Ber Shmuel said is a mutter. So far we have our 3 boxes. Our 4th one so far is not looking so good. Says the Gemara, no. According to you, according to your rationale, Rav Yirmiyah, teisi mi binyanav mi ola. I don't need chatos. I could have learned from an ola. My time alo asi. Why is it that we didn't use the binyan of ola to teach me about an asham needing to be in the north? Says the Gemara, mishum deikal nifrach, because an ola is totally different than an asham. Mala ola shekain kalil. So that doesn't work. An ola is completely burned up. You can't compare that to an asham. So the fact that an ola would need to be done in the north, that's not a raya that an asham should need to be done in the north. And chatas nami ikal mifrach. Even if you wanted to argue that we should have learned from a binyan av, chatas is also different than an asham because malachatas sheken mechaperes al chayve krisus. We know that a chatas is a very powerful korban. The korban chatas is able to undo chayve krisus. We've had this on almost every blot for the last few pages. That is one of the uniquenesses, probably the major uniqueness of the korban chatas. So therefore, perhaps the reason why we did not use the word tzfona is not because you're not allowed to learn a binyanav from a hekesh, but because that binyanav is very difficult to learn. Because there's a chiddush of ola that it's kalil, and there's a chiddush of chatas that it's mechaperes on krisos. So says the Gemara, okay, very good. Chada mechadu lo asya. All right, I can't learn asham from either ola or from chatas, but perhaps the Gemara says teisi chada metarte. Perhaps I can learn out asham from both of the others. And maybe I shouldn't have to have the word tzfona by one of the 3. So says the Gemara, mehai tesi. Where are we learning from? Where do we not want to see the word tzfona and learn from the other 2? If you want to say lo nichtav rachmana ola, if you want to say that the Torah should not have written the word tzfona by an ola, v'tesi mechatos ve'asham, and we could have just extrapolated from the tarte, from the world of chatas and asham, there's something unique about a chatas and an asham, which is that they generate kapara. So we couldn't have it be that the word sfona was missing from ola. We could never have extrapolated from an asham and a chatas because they're unique in that they generate kapara. If you want to say lo nichtov rachmana bechatas, let's say the word chatas didn't have tzona, but asham and ola did, v'tesi mehanach, and we're going to learn from the combo deal of asham and ola back to the world of chatas. No, malahanach, when it comes to an asham and when it comes to an ola, shekein zecharim, those are all males. However, a chatas can be a female. So therefore, we can't learn from asham and ola back to chatas because the genders of those 2 are all male. Masha ein kain, when it comes to a chatas, that could even be a female. Maybe you want to say lo nichtov be'asham, that perhaps we shouldn't have the word safon by the word asham. V'teisi mehanach, we should learn it from a chatas and an ola. No, malahanach shekein yeshnon b'tzibor kibiyachid. That by a chatas, we have a chatas for a tzibor, we have an ola for a tzibor. You know what we never have for a tzibor? An asham. An asham is a private korban. It never is brought on a tzibur level. So therefore, says the Gemara, there's no way to learn this out. We actually don't have clarity over here as to what the answer is to this question, because we thought that perhaps the fact that Sfona was missing was because you're not allowed to build a binyanav on a hekesh. Says the Gemara, no, that's not why. It's because there's each of the scenarios are so mechudash. We can't learn one-on-one. We can't learn asham from ola. We can't learn asham from chatas. You can't learn chatas and asham from ola and all the other permutations therein. So maybe that's why. So we really don't know exactly what the halacha would be in this case. Now, all of this was bucket number 1. If you look back at the parentheses that we started with, we spoke about hekesh and then the 4 samples of hekesh. Hekesh to hekesh, hekesh to gzeir shava, hekesh to kal v'chomer, hekesh to binyanav. Now we're moving on to the second one, which is gzeir shava. And the Gemara says a third of the way down, davar halamed b'gzeir shava, mahu she'alamed b'hekesh. If I started with the gzeir shava, am I allowed to take the existing gzeir shava and learn a new din based on a hekesh from that new gzeir shava? So says the Gemara, Omar Rav Papa, the Torah says, V'zos Toras Zevach Hashlamim im al Toda. So we see the Torah brings together a Zevachim, the Shlamim and the Toda. Lamadnu, what did we learn over here? And here's our Hekesh. Lamadnu latoda shaba min hamaiser. We're able to extrapolate from the world of shlamim to the world of toda, that if we have a toda that comes from meiser, shlamim da asumi meiser. So we see that we're allowed to take meiser funds both for toda and for shlamim. Where did we get this from? It's a hekesh from the psukim, right? Because the Torah in one pasuk talks about shlamim and toda. That's a hekesh. And shlamim gufayhu minalan. How do we know that the shlamim, which was the starting point of the hekesh, meichatesi, that you can fund that from meiser? Tichsiv sham. Oh, so the gzeira shava we have by shlamim. Now you want to make a hekesh to say shlamim to toda? So it seems like that's allowed because that's what happened by meiser. Good answer. So now again, gzeira shava to hekesh. The gzeira shava by shlamim that it can be funded by meiser. Hekesh to extend it to toda. Seems like it works. So the Gemara says we're halfway down on Nun Amar Aleph. Amar lemar zutra breid Rav Mari Ravina. Hold on 1 second. Meiser dagon chulen be'almahu. Remember what we said earlier on the beginning, on the bottom of Mem Tesem Beis? We only care about this conversation as it relates to Kodshim. It's not a general Shas conversation. You're talking about the Meiser. It's Meiser dagon. It's Meiser on grain. That's not Kodshim. I don't care what you do in those cases. Mutter v'mutter, lamed milamed. I don't care why you can cross drushes, no problem at all. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about kodshim. So it says the Gemara, Amar le, Amar, when this was said, Amra, was it said that lamad kodesh umelamed kodesh, that both have to be kodesh? What if only one is kodesh? What were we dealing with? Shlamim and toda, not just meiser. Well, shlamim is kodshim. It's kodshim kalim, but it's kodshim. Nevertheless, so it doesn't have to be that it doesn't have to be that both sides are kachim or that no sides are kachim. Even one side kachim, that's still kachim. So that's what the Gemara responds over here. Therefore, says the Gemara that it is a very good proof, and therefore we assume that when it comes to a starting gzeira shava, we are allowed to build a hekesh on top of that. That's box number 5 for the day, if you're following. Here's box number 6. We're about 2/3 of the way down. Davar halamed b'gzeira shava. Mahu she'lamed b'gzeira shava. If I start with a gzeira shava, can I extend from gzeira shava number 1 to gzeira shava number 2? Is that allowed? It says the Gemara, Amar Rami Bar Chama, Tanya, we have a brisa. Soles morbecha. It's a particular type of korban mincha. Lamanu the revucha sheba soles. That this revucha type of mincha has to be brought from soles, which is fine flour. So it says the Gemara, chalos minayin. Chalos is a different type of mincha. Talmud Omar chalos. There's a gzeira shava for you. Rekikin minayin. Says the Gemara, matzos. So we have these two different gzeiros shava. Let's just take a look at a quick Rashi because they look like unrelated gzeiros shava. They just look parallel. So Rashi says, Dibra maschel matzos. Rashi is about 9-10 lines before the wide lines. Ne'emar b'rekikin matzos, v'ne'emar b'chalos matzos, v'alfinan rekikin michalos, v'chalos lamdu merevucha, ushneim b'gzeira shava. So they are linked because of the word matzos was applicable by rekikin and by chalos. So that's what the Gemara says. We have our double gzeira shava. So therefore it appears that it works. Amar le Ravina mimayda matzos mechalos gamar mehechatesi, that's in fact how we learn. Dilma mima fetan or gamar. Maybe we learned it from another pasuk altogether. So therefore you can't bring a raya because it might not be a double gzeira shava. Ella, the Gemara suggests, Ella Amar Rava, Tanya, we have another thing going on here that's our proof about a double gzeira shava. The Gemara says, Vikirbo ufir show. This is talking about the innards of the animal, what's inside the intestines, all the perish, it's gross, all of that. And the pasuk says, V'hotzi, that it's not burned on the mizbech. If you look at the whole pasuk, it says over there, V'hotzi es kol apar el michutz lamachan el makom tor el shefech deshen v'saraf. It gets burnt outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Melamed, that pasuk teaches us shemotzio shalim, that we take out the animal whole. Yachal yisrafenu shalim. Okay, we took it out whole. But are we going to burn it whole? Ne'emar kan rosha uchra'av, v'ne'emar lahalan rosha uchra'av. We have in multiple places this discussion. One is by an ola, and one is by one of the various parim that we've been discussing. Malahalan, just like by an ola al yadei nituach, that when we put an ola on the mizbeach, it's being cut into parts. Afkan, the pasuk that we started with was by the par Kohen Gadol and the par Kohen Mashiach. Afkan al yedei nituach. I says the Gemara Malahalan that when it comes to an olah behefshet, when it comes to an olah, we don't just cut the animal, we skin the animal. Afkan nami, perhaps by the par, we should also skin the animal. Behefshet. Talmud Kirbo upirsho. My Talmud, what does that part of the pasuk teach me? Amar of Papa, kishem shepirsho bekirbo, kach besara beoro. Just like we keep the peresh, we keep the intestines inside, so too we also keep the skin on. Now this is a multi-level, we're not done yet. We have one more brisa to learn, but we can see the Gzeira Shavas that he has in here, the double Gzeira Shava so far. The Tanya, and the last line, Rebbe Omer, Ne'emar Kan or Ubasar Uperesh. This pasuk is by Par Besar She'oma Kippurim. V'Ne'emar Lahalan, and by Par Kohen Mashiach, we have Or Ubasar Uperesh. Ma Lahalan al Yedei Nituach Shelo Behefshet. Af Kan al Yedei Nituach Shelo Behefshet. So what we learn from here is that we are allowed to stack Gzeros Shava on one another because we have this flow. If you look back at the beginning of Rava's arguments on the bottom, we had Vikirbo Upirsho, we had Roshu Uchrav multiple times, we had Behefshet multiple times, and then on the top of the page we had Or Basar Perish. So we're allowed to stack Gzeros Shavas. That's box number 5. Box number 6, on the top of Nun Amud Beis, 3 lines down, Davar Halamid B'Gzeira Shava, Maushe Yilamed B'Kal V'Chomer. If I start with a Gzeira Shava, can I then have a Kal V'Chomer? So of course the Gemara cleverly says, of course, but it's a Kal V'Chomer that I have to teach it from. Right, let's just get clear. If I start with a Gzeira Shava, am I allowed to use a Kal V'Chomer? How do we answer the question? With a Kal V'Chomer. Okay? Now that's fair because the Kal V'Chomer we're about to read is not on a Gzeira Shava. But you got to just hold cup. The question is a hard question, right? If we start with a regular Gzeira Shava, and I want to take the information I learned from that Gzeira Shava, and from it I want to use a Kal V'Chomer, how do I know that's allowed? Because of a Kal V'Chomer. But what's the Kal V'Chomer? Uma hekesh, going back to what we learned about on the bottom of Mem Tesamud Beis, she'enu malamed behekesh imidirava imidiravina. We learned, the first box that we learned is that you cannot learn one hekesh from another, and our Mari Makomos were from Rava and Ravina. Melamed bekal v'chomer, but we are allowed to go from a hekesh to a kal v'chomer, midatana de Rabbi Shmuel, like we saw at the top of Nun Amud Aleph. So a Gzeira Shava hamalamedes behekesh midirav papa. We know that a Gzeira Shava can have a hekesh like we saw on the previous Amud. Eino din shetalamid bekal v'chomer. All the more so it should be able to. Beautiful kal v'chomer. It is a little confusing because just the way it's phrased, but it's nevertheless a clear kal v'chomer. Says the Gemara, I'm with you. Hanicha, that would work. Leman de islay de Rav Papa, which is the shita of Ravina. That's very nuanced, but that's what we saw on the previous page. That according to Rav Papa, I agree with you. According to someone who's not Rav Papa, and the example of this would be Mar Zutra from the previous page, what would he say? Because he did not agree with this principle. Ella, we have to find another Kal V'Chomer. Let's remember our question. Sorry for being overly explanatory, but this is extremely detailed. How do we know, says the Gemara, that if I have a Gzeira Shava, that I'm allowed to make a Kal V'Chomer from that Gzeira Shava to teach me a new halacha? So the Gemara says 12 lines down, 10 lines down, Ela Kal V'Chomer. Uma hekesh she'ein malamed behekesh imidiravina. That was box number 1. That if we have a starting hekesh, I'm not allowed to extend to another hekesh, which we learned from Rava Ravina. And even then, malamed bekal v'chomer midatana de Rabbi Shmuel. That we saw already that you're allowed to go from a hekesh to a kal v'chomer. Then a gzeira shava, hamalamedes b'gzeira shava chaverta. If I'm allowed to stack gzeira shava, which we just finished learning on the top of this page, midrami bar chama, eino din shetalamid b'kal v'chomer. Pashad, it should be true. If you can stack 2 gzeira shavas one on top of another, then if you can have a gzeira shava, you're for sure allowed to add a kal v'chomer, and that the Gemara accepts. And what is that? That's box number 1, 2, 3. That's 7. So here is box number 8. Davar halamid b'gzeira shava. Mahu she'elamed bebinyanav. Teku, we have no idea. So these are 8 boxes. So what we've done so far, just to review, is we've learned about Hekish, starting with Hekish, and then can we then add a hekesh or add a gzeira shava or add a kal v'chomer or add a binyanav? Then we spoke about gzeira shava and asked, what about after making a gzeira shava, another hekesh, or adding a gzeira shava, or adding a kal v'chomer, adding a binyanav? Now we're going to move to the next bucket, which is the bucket of kal v'chomer. And then after these four, we're going to stop. So we will have learned 12 boxes today, and then we're going to stop. Davar halamed, we're a third of the way down on Nunamid base. Davar halamed b'gzeira shava, mahu she'elam, wrong line. Davar halamed b'kal v'chomer, excuse me. If I start out with a kal v'chomer, mahu she'elamed b'hekesh, am I allowed to then add a hekesh on top of that kal v'chomer? So the Gemara says, yes, well, kal v'chomer. I have a very logical reason to assume you're allowed to do this. Umag gzeira shava, she'ein lamda b'hekesha. Rabbi Yochanan. According to Rabbi Yochanan, we know that from a gzeira shava you're not allowed to add a hekesh, but from a hekesh you're allowed to add a hekesh. Malam made behekesh midrab papa. Then kal v'chomer halam made hekesh midatana de b'shmal eino din she'alam made behekesh. All the more so we should allow a hekesh over here. If a hekesh is allowed to be on top of a hekesh, all the more so a hekesh should be allowed to be on top of a kal v'chomer. Says the Gemara, like it said earlier, I agree only to those who agree with Rav Papa, which, as we mentioned, was Ravina. So we don't know the answer to this question. So let's just review that if we have a starting kal v'chomer, we're not sure if you're allowed to have a hekesh according to those who don't hold like Rav Papa. According to those who do hold like Rav Papa, you're good to go. That is box number 9. Here's box number 10. Davar halamed b'kal v'chomer, ma'u she'elamed b'gzeira shava. If I start out with a kal v'chomer, and that's clear, am I then allowed to extend to a gzeira shava? So the Gemara says, kal v'chomer. I just feel like sometimes they're just trying to test if we're paying attention. Like I'm going to throw this little wrench in here and see if you notice, Let's get the question clear. I have a kal v'chomer. I also see the potential to make a gzeira shava. Am I allowed to do that? Says the Gemara, here's your kal v'chomer. Umag gzeira shava she'eina lameda b'hekesha. You're not allowed to stack a gzeira shava and a hekesh midar Rabbi Yochanan, but melamed b'gzeira shava. But that you're allowed to do midar Bar Chama. So then a kal v'chomer, which is halamed b'hekesh midatana de Rabbi Shmuel, eino din shehalamed b'gzeira shava. If you're able to learn a hekesh on a kal v'chomer, certainly you can learn a gzeira shava on a kal v'chomer, and the Gemara accepts that, and therefore that is considered legal. That if we have a kal v'chomer, we are allowed to stack a gzeira shava on the kal v'chomer. That was 8, 9, 10. This is the 11th out of 12 boxes that we're learning tonight. We're going to be stopping about 9, 10 lines before the end of the page. Here is box number 11. Davar halamed b'kal v'chomer, mahu she'alamed b'kal v'chomer. Can we stack kal v'chomers? Is that allowed? So the Gemara says, kal v'chomer. Umag gzeira shava she'eina lameda b'hekesh midar Rabbi Yochanan melamed b'kal v'chomer keda amran. Just like we know that there are scenarios where we can learn this hekesh, like Rabbi Yochanan wanted to say, and we can learn a kal v'chomer halamed b'hekesh. If you have a kal v'chomer that's stacked on a hekesh midatana de Rabbi Shmuel, eino din shelamed b'kal v'chomer. Certainly that should work. V'zehu, the Gemara says, this is kal v'chomer ben kal v'chomer. That's your example of 2 kal v'chomers. This kal v'chomer taught me of 2 kal v'chomers. So that's allowed. Says the Gemara, that's ben benoshel kal v'chomer. That's a triple, not a double, and you're not allowed to do that. So the Gemara says, you're right. I have to change my, I made it too difficult, the Gemara says. So therefore the Gemara says, ela kal v'chomer, here's the final kal v'chomer. The Gemara says, Uma hekesh she'enu lamed behekesh. You're not allowed to do stack hekesh midiravi midiravina. But melabin mikal v'chomer, you are allowed to add a kal v'chomer to a hekesh midatana de Rabbi Shmuel. A kal v'chomer halamed mi hekesh midatana de Rabbi Shmuel. Eino din she'lamed b'kal v'chomer. V'zehu kal v'chomer ben kal v'chomer. So that we do allow. So we do allow the stacking of kal v'chomers. Oh, I think I'm going to have to stop right. Why did I write this here? Oh, we'll have to pause right here on the 12th box. So we did 11 out of 12 boxes. We'll stop right here at what would be the 12th box of Davar Halamid B'Kal V'Chomer Ma'u She'Lamed B'Binyanav. Nir Hashem will pick up right here starting tomorrow night. If you flip ahead, you can see that Nun Aleph Amud Beis has 3 lines. So we'll definitely be fine. I'm probably going to jump a little bit ahead because the blot, as we move toward the week, are going to get a little heavier and I want to stay on track. So we'll pause right here, wishing you all a beautiful night.